He walked away from the throne of the world's most powerful empire. All because of what happened inside this house. Fort Belvedere was never meant to hold a secret strong enough to fracture a monarchy. It was supposed to be a retreat, a royal hideaway, a place where the future king could breathe. Instead, it became the quiet stage for one of the greatest constitutional crises in British history. Long before the scandal, before the whispered rumors and the frozen smiles, Fort Belvedere sat on the edges of Windsor Great Park like a forgotten chess piece. Built in the 18th century as a decorative folly, it wasn't a palace, not even close. It was a whimsical star-shaped fort designed more for show than defense. But the story hidden inside its brick-lined rooms would shake the world far more than any battlefield ever could. Prince Edward, the man who would become King Edward VIII, found the fort in the 1920s. It was crumbling, unused, barely more than a curiosity. But he loved it instantly. He restored it, expanded it, and filled it with modern luxuries. For the first time in his life, he had a space that felt like his. A sanctuary. A place where he wasn't the heir to an empire, but simply a man. And in that private space, he would also fall in love. The first surprising fact is this. Fort Belvedere is the only royal residence where a king has signed away his own crown. The second is that the decision wasn't made in a moment of passion, but over years of slow, quiet unraveling. Inside these walls, Edward hosted parties that defied every royal expectation. Jazz music pulsed through rooms once designed for military pomp. Guests drank, laughed, and broke unspoken rules of royal formality. The fort became a symbol of modernity, of rebellion, of a monarchy drifting out of step with the roaring century. And it was here, away from London, away from duty, that the king met the woman who would define his legacy. Wallis Simpson. She was American, divorced, unapologetically bold. Everything the British establishment feared. Their relationship bloomed behind the curtained windows of Fort Belvedere, where they believed they were shielded from the world. But nothing involving the future king is ever truly private. Rumors escaped the fort like smoke through cracks. Politicians whispered. Bishops protested. Newspapers, bound by strict censorship, said nothing, but they waited. The fort, once a symbol of escape, became a gilded trap. Edward believed he could have both the crown and the woman he loved. But the truth, revealed slowly and painfully inside this house, was the opposite. Here comes the cliffhanger. One winter night, inside the quiet study of Fort Belvedere, Edward signed a document so unprecedented, even his own ancestors wouldn't have believed it possible. But before the ink dried, a secret conversation took place, one that historians rarely mention. An exchange that nearly changed everything. Before we reach that moment, the story pulls us deeper into the fort's shadowed past. Long before Edward arrived, Fort Belvedere had already seen darkness. In the early 1800s, one of its residents, Prince Frederick, Duke of Cumberland, was entangled in a scandal so disturbing it was whispered about in elite circles for decades. The details were never fully proven, but they were enough to stain the fort's name long before Edward ever stepped foot inside it. Some said the place had an energy, an echo of secrecy, that seemed to follow every royal who lived there. Edward ignored all of it. He filled the fort with life, with warmth, with the illusion of freedom. But as the 1930s marched forward, and Wallis's divorce hearings grew closer, the walls of Fort Belvedere tightened around him. Every decision he made here sent ripples across the empire. Every moment with Wallis deepened the crisis unfolding outside. And yet, inside the fort, time seemed to stand still. Friends described a strange calm, as if Edward truly believed the world would bend for him. But the monarchy does not bend. Not even for its king. And in a few short months, the fort he loved would become the very place where he would lose everything. He didn't know it yet, but every quiet morning at Fort Belvedere was pushing him closer to a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Edward rose early, always before his staff, always before the frost melted from the grass outside. He liked the silence. He liked the feeling that, for a moment, he wasn't watched. The monarchy is built on scrutiny. But here, behind the winding roads of Windsor Great Park, he believed he could outrun it. But the truth was already closing in. By the mid-1930s, Britain was a nation standing on a fault line. The Great Depression had not fully healed. Political storms were rising in Europe. The British public wanted stability. A steady hand. A king who would reassure them that the world still made sense. Instead, they were about to get the most controversial love story in royal history. Wallis Simpson had not yet divorced her second husband, and still, she and Edward spent more time at Fort Belvedere than anywhere else. They dined in the conservatory. They walked the grounds. They held long private conversations in rooms no one else entered. Those who visited the fort described an almost surreal domesticity, as if Edward were already living the life he wanted, long before he earned it. But there was a problem. He wasn't just a man in love. He was the future King of England. One surprising fact many people don't know. The British government had been monitoring Edward's relationship long before the public ever heard Wallis's name. Intelligence officers quietly collected information, tracking dinner guests, whispered conversations, even political opinions shared at the fort's weekend parties. And something else alarmed them even more. Foreign governments were watching too. Diplomats reported Wallis's influence. Some believed she held more sway over Edward than his ministers did. Others claimed she shared royal conversations with people far outside Britain. Whether true or exaggerated, it was enough to worry those in power. The monarchy is a symbol, but it is also a political force. A compromise king was a national threat. Yet, inside the fort, Edward seemed blissfully unbothered. His staff noticed the transformation. He laughed more. He worked less. He slipped into a kind of unshakable certainty, an unwavering belief that somehow his reign would rewrite the rules of monarchy. That if he insisted loudly enough, the world would allow a divorced American woman to become queen. But the world was not ready. And as news of Wallis's impending divorce reached political circles, the tension grew unbearable. Prime ministers, cabinet members, advisors, to all understood what Edward refused to accept. He cannot marry a woman with two living ex-husbands. Not then. Not in 1936. Not while leading an empire that stretched across continents. Here, in the quiet corridors of Fort Belvedere, the crisis began to crystallize. The newspapers still remained silent, legally barred from reporting the story, but journalists were already preparing for the moment the censorship lifted. And when it did, the monarchy would explode. Here comes the cliffhanger. In late autumn, during a private evening at the fort, Edward received a warning. One so stark, so final, that even he paused. Not from a politician. Not from the church. But from someone inside the royal family. The message was simple. If he continued down this path, he would not merely lose the crown. He would divide the nation. That revelation rattled him. But only for a moment. Because the next morning, Edward made a decision so bold it stunned even his closest friends. Rather than distance himself from Wallis, he brought her more deeply into the inner sanctum of Fort Belvedere. He refused every request to step back. He rejected every suggestion to reconsider. He insisted that the monarchy must evolve, that the people would support him if he explained the truth. He believed the public adored him enough to forgive anything. But he was wrong. Another surprising fact: private letters from the era show that government officials had drafted emergency plans in case the public rioted when the scandal broke. They feared the country might fracture around the king himself. And it all centered on this one house. This one love. This belief that the crown could bend to desire. Inside Fort Belvedere, the clock was ticking. In a few weeks, the king would take a step that no British monarch had dared to take in 1,000 years of history. By December 1936, Fort Belvedere no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a pressure chamber. Every letter that arrived carried urgency. Every phone call carried consequences. Every advisor, every minister, every royal relative now echoed the same impossible message. Choose the crown. or choose her. But Edward believed there had to be a third path, a way to keep both. For weeks he clung to a single idea, a morganatic marriage. It meant Wallis could legally become his wife, without becoming queen. No crown, no title, no constitutional role. Just a private marriage. To Edward it seemed perfect. To everyone else it was unthinkable. Here in the cold winter halls of Fort Belvedere, the debates began. Ministers arrived in dark cars with frost clinging to the edges of their coats. They climbed the narrow steps and entered the king's study, where Edward, pale, exhausted, defiant, insisted that Britain would accept his plan. But he underestimated the moment. He misread the mood. He misjudged the fear that lived beneath the surface of the British establishment. One surprising fact: not a single government within the entire British Commonwealth supported Edward's proposal. Australia rejected it. Canada rejected it. South Africa rejected it. Even the Irish Free State, barely separated from Britain, rejected it. A united front against their king. The message was unmistakable. If Edward insisted on marrying Wallis, the monarchy itself would fracture. And so the fort transformed into the epicenter of a constitutional earthquake. Staff recalled the tense silences. Visitors described an air so heavy it felt like the rooms themselves were holding their breath. Cabinet notes from those days reveal something extraordinary. Ministers feared that if Edward refused to abdicate, they would have no choice but to resign, triggering a national collapse. And still, he refused to surrender. Wallis, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own. The newspapers finally broke their silence. Her name filled headlines across the world. She was mocked, vilified, dissected. Some called her ambitious. Others called her dangerous. A few even claimed she was a foreign agent influencing the king. That rumor, strange as it sounds, spread widely enough that British intelligence quietly launched an investigation. That's the second surprising fact. MI5 actively monitored Wallis during the crisis, compiling reports on her friends, her finances, and her alleged political sympathies. Inside Fort Belvedere, the king read those same headlines and grew more determined. He summoned advisors. He lectured ministers. He insisted that love, real love, was worth bending traditions for. But something deeper was unfolding. For the first time in his life, he was discovering the true limits of royal power. The crown wasn't his to reshape. It wasn't a personal possession. It belonged to the nation, and the nation was saying no also. Then came the night that changed everything. Here comes the mid-segment cliffhanger. A car arrived at the fort long after sunset. A single visitor stepped out, one of the few people whose words still carried weight with Edward. What he said inside that quiet study would push the king toward a decision the world still debates to this day. But before we reach that conversation, something else must be understood. Edward had been raised to believe his charisma was his greatest weapon. That if he spoke directly to the people, they would rise to his defense. And so he prepared a broadcast, a speech that would explain his intentions, appeal to public sympathy, and pressure the government into compromise. But the cabinet learned of the plan, and they were terrified. A monarch appealing directly to the people against his own government was a constitutional explosion waiting to happen. They responded with a move so forceful it stunned even Edward. If he attempted the broadcast, they would legally prevent it, and potentially strip him of authority before he ever reached the microphone. Suddenly, time ran out. The walls of Fort Belvedere, once symbols of freedom, now felt like the boundaries of a shrinking world. Every path he took led back to the same impossible doorway. Stay a king, and lose her. Keep her, and cease to be king. In the final days before the abdication, Edward paced these rooms like a man suspended between two lives. The staff heard footsteps echoing long after midnight. Letters lay opened on his desk. A pen sat beside a document waiting for his signature. A document that would erase a crown. By the end of the week, Fort Belvedere would witness history. But not the kind Britain expected. The visitor who stepped into Fort Belvedere that cold December night was Edward's younger brother, the man who would soon become King George VI. He didn't arrive with threats. He didn't arrive with politics. He arrived with something far heavier. Fear. Not fear for the monarchy. Not fear for the government. But fear for Edward himself. He found his brother alone in the study, the fire burning low, documents scattered across the desk like fallen leaves. Edward looked exhausted, thinner than he'd ever been, his confidence cracked beneath the weight of the crisis. For a moment the two men weren't royal figures. They were simply brothers caught in a moment too large for either of them. The future king spoke quietly. He told Edward that the cabinet was unified. The Commonwealth was unified. Even the wider public, polls suggested, would not accept Wallis as queen, no matter how the story was framed. But what came next is the part rarely repeated in documentaries. His brother didn't ask him to abdicate. He asked him something far more painful. Do you truly believe she wants this life? This spotlight? This crown she can never wear? That question pierced through the fog of certainty Edward had wrapped himself in. Because the truth was, he didn't know. All around him the fort felt suddenly hollow. For months, this house had been his refuge. But now it felt like a memory dissolving in real time, each room holding a version of his life he could no longer keep. And yet, even then, he hesitated. He looked out the study window onto the lawns covered in winter frost, and for a fleeting second, he imagined what might still be possible. Perhaps another speech. Perhaps a last negotiation. Perhaps the world could still bend. But history was already moving without him. One surprising fact: Wallis was not even in Britain during these final days. She had been sent to France, partly for protection, partly to avoid fueling the flames. She waited there in near isolation while the world debated her future. Some newspapers even speculated she would end the relationship to save the crown. Others claimed she was preparing to flee Europe entirely. But inside Fort Belvedere, Edward believed only one thing. He could not let her go. Then came the moment no one had prepared for. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin arrived for one final meeting. This conversation, held in the king's own residence, was perhaps the most consequential hour in modern monarchy. Baldwin laid out the facts with brutal clarity. The government would not support the marriage. The church would not sanction it. Parliament would not ratify it, and the people were unlikely to stand behind it. Edward listened. Silent. Still. Composed in a way that frightened even those who knew him best. And then, without argument, he made his choice. Not in public. Not on radio. Not with ceremony. He told Baldwin, quietly but unmistakably, "I will go." But the real shock, almost never mentioned, is what he said next. "I have never wanted to be king." Those words trembled through the halls of Fort Belvedere like a confession whispered too late. His staff never forgot the change in his voice. He sounded relieved. Crushed. Human. Here comes the cliffhanger. But before the abdication could be made official, something happened inside the fort that nearly derailed the entire process. An unexpected visitor, carrying news from France, news that made Edward question whether the woman he loved even wanted him to give up the crown. Within hours, letters were flying across borders. Messages were rushed between London and Paris. Even the foreign press caught wind of a new dispute, a rift between Edward and Wallis just days before the abdication. Some historians believe the crisis almost reversed itself in that moment. Others think Edward was merely grasping at the last fragile thread of uncertainty. But by dawn the moment had passed. Edward walked through the corridors of Fort Belvedere with a strange haunting calm. The decision was made. The documents were ready. The crown he had been born to wear would soon become a footnote in his own story. Staff later said that morning felt like the end of something larger than a reign. It felt like the end of an era, an entire concept of monarchy shattering not with violence or revolution, but with a signature penned inside a quiet estate. And within 24 hours that signature would be on the page. The morning Edward signed the abdication papers, Fort Belvedere was unnervingly still. No crowds. No ceremony. Just a handful of men gathered in a room, that suddenly felt too small for the weight of the moment. He sat at the desk, the same desk where he had written letters to Wallace, where he had planned parties, where he had once believed he could reshape the monarchy itself. Now it held only one document. A short, simple, devastating declaration. He picked up the pen. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Not the ministers. Not the witnesses. Not even Edward himself. He hesitated, not because he doubted the choice, but because he understood, in that tiny pause, that history itself was about to pivot. Everything written about him, everything remembered about him, everything taught about him, would begin with this moment. Then he signed. The King of the United Kingdom, Emperor of India, and head of a global empire, laid down his crown inside a private fort overlooking the quiet woods of Windsor. It was the first voluntary abdication in British history. And with the final stroke of ink, the world shifted. One surprising fact: the pen Edward used that morning wasn't preserved by the royal family. It was taken by one of the witnesses, a small act of personal keepsake that today leaves historians debating where it ended up. Once the document was complete, something remarkable happened. Edward didn't look devastated. He looked lighter, as if the impossible weight pressing on his chest had finally been lifted. But the silence that followed was heavier than anything he had felt before. Because signing the abdication was only the first step. He still had to speak to the nation. The famous broadcast that evening became one of the most quoted speeches in modern royal history. But few people know this. The speech wasn't written at Buckingham Palace. It wasn't drafted in Downing Street. It was shaped right here inside Fort Belvedere, edited, revised, whispered aloud, cut apart, and reassembled until it carried the exact tone he wanted. A farewell not just to a crown, but to a life he had never fully chosen. When he stepped into the room to record the broadcast, his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the knowledge that millions were listening. Millions who had seen him as modern, charming, almost cinematic. Millions who believed he could lead Britain into a new era. Saul. He told them he could not carry on without the woman I love. But what he didn't say, what he had confessed only in private, is that he no longer believed he could be the king the nation demanded. Here comes the cliffhanger. But while the world heard a love story, something else was happening behind the scenes. That same night, a report arrived at Fort Belvedere from France. News about Wallace that stunned Edward and raised questions he had never dared to ask. Questions that would haunt him long after the crown was gone. Before he had time to process those doubts, Edward had to leave the fort forever. He packed only a few belongings. Uniforms he would never wear again. Personal letters. Small tokens from friends. Everything else, decades of royal possessions, would remain behind. What few people realize is that Edward did not leave Fort Belvedere triumphantly or dramatically. He left quietly, almost secretly, slipping out of the estate before dawn. Staff watched him step into the car. They saw the way he paused at the door, taking one last look at the place that had given him his happiest memories and cost him his entire destiny. The drive away from the fort was short, but it felt like a lifetime. When he reached Portsmouth to board the ship that would take him to exile, crowds gathered, not to jeer, but to stare. To witness the monarch who had traded an empire for love. Some waved handkerchiefs. Others stood stone still. A few tearful voices rose above the silence. But Edward didn't look back. He was no longer king. He was no longer responsible for the empire he had nearly fractured. He was simply a man heading into an uncertain future. Yet even as he crossed the channel, the consequences of his decision were already unfolding. Monarchy had a new king. Britain had a new ruler. And Wallis Simpson, forgotten in France, had no idea what awaited her next. Because the storm was only beginning. While Edward crossed the channel in silence, Wallis Simpson sat alone in a borrowed villa outside Cannes, surrounded by newspapers she refused to read. She had heard whispers of the speech. She knew the abdication was imminent. But what she didn't know, what no one told her, was that Edward had already left Fort Belvedere, and with it, the life he once commanded. When the news finally reached her, she broke down. Not with joy, not with triumph, but with a kind of stunned disbelief. She had become the most hated woman in the British Empire. She had ignited a constitutional crisis. And now the man she loved had abandoned the throne for her. An act so enormous she had never truly believed he would go through with it. One surprising fact: Wallis tried to stop the abdication. Historians have uncovered letters she wrote to Edward during those final days, begging him to reconsider, fearing she had become a burden too heavy to bear. She even offered to disappear from his life entirely. But by the time Edward received those letters, the decision was already sealed. And so in France, Wallis waited, isolated, scrutinized, and terrified. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Fort Belvedere was undergoing its own transformation. The fort that had once echoed with jazz and laughter now felt like a ghost. Staff moved quietly through emptied rooms, carefully removing Edward's personal items. A new king, George VIII, had taken the throne, and with it came a wave of uncertainty. For the first time in centuries, the monarchy had cracked in full view of the world. Inside government offices, officials worked feverishly to stabilize the public mood. Foreign newspapers ridiculed Britain for allowing romance to topple an empire. American columnists cast Edward as a tragic hero. European leaders saw opportunity. A single private decision had become an international spectacle. But the most delicate task of all was still ahead: handling Wallis. Here comes the mid-segment cliffhanger. Just days after the abdication, British intelligence intercepted a set of communications involving Wallis, messages suggesting she might have closer ties to certain foreign figures than anyone previously knew. These reports were rushed directly to government officials, and eventually to the new king himself. And for a brief moment, the royal family wondered if Edward had abdicated for a woman whose loyalties were not entirely clear. To this day, historians debate the truth behind those reports. Some say they were exaggerated. Others believe they were genuine. But in 1936, at the height of panic, they were alarming enough to spark a secret discussion. Should Wallis even be allowed to marry the former king? The idea of blocking the marriage circulated through the halls of power. Some ministers argued she posed a national risk. Others insisted the scandal had already gone too far to reverse. In the end, the government chose a middle path, one that wounded Edward more deeply than any political blow. When Wallis' divorce was finalized and she prepared to marry Edward, the royal family declared they would not attend the wedding. Not the new king. Not the Queen Mother. Not a single senior royal. Even more painful, Wallis would not receive the style, Her Royal Highness. She would become the Duchess of Windsor, by title only. An outsider. A permanent symbol of rupture. And Edward, who had given up everything for her, was powerless to change it. He raged in private. He pleaded with his brother. He wrote letters that went unanswered. It was the first time he understood that abdication did not simply free him from responsibility. It stripped him of authority, of influence, of the respect he once carried effortlessly. Meanwhile, Wallis faced a different kind of punishment. For months she could not leave her villa without reporters swarming the gates. British newspapers dissected her past. American outlets painted her as a manipulative temptress. European tabloids speculated about every aspect of her life. The world had reshaped her into a caricature she no longer recognized. When Edward finally arrived in France, the reunion was quiet. Not cinematic, not triumphant, but emotionally raw. Witnesses, said Wallis, looked pale, almost fragile. Edward, by contrast, appeared determined, clinging to the belief that now, without the crown, they could finally live freely. But neither understood the full cost yet. The world they were stepping into was not a love story. It was a life of permanent exile. And the house that had sparked their story, Fort Belvedere, was now locked behind them forever. Exile did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with emptiness. Edward and Wallis settled first in France, then later in Portugal, and finally in a quiet house on the outskirts of Paris. No crowds greeted them. No royal carriages followed. The man who had once been expected to rule a global empire now struggled to find a purpose beyond the woman he had sacrificed everything for. And that sacrifice came with shadows neither of them anticipated. Wallace felt them first. She noticed how Edward flinched when he passed a newspaper stand. How his laughter, once easy and bright, grew forced. How he paced late at night, whispering fragments of speeches he would never again deliver. He had traded a throne for love, but no one had warned him what it meant to live without the world he once commanded. One surprising fact: Edward spent years lobbying, quietly, desperately, for Wallace to be given the title, Her Royal Highness. He wrote to his brother, to advisors, to foreign leaders who might influence the crown. Every attempt failed. That rejection cut him deeper than any criticism from the public, because it meant one thing he could never admit aloud. The monarchy had moved on without him. And despite her outward poise, Wallace felt another kind of pressure, the weight of being the woman blamed for the fracture of a dynasty. She had never expected to become a symbol. She had never wanted the world to watch her every move. But now, everywhere she went, eyes followed. In private, their marriage grew more complicated than the fairy tale narrative history often paints. Edward, without duties, drifted. He immersed himself in hobbies, golf, parties, social gatherings. But these held none of the meaning he once found in public service. Friends noticed how he increasingly relied on Wallace for emotional direction, as if she were the compass keeping him steady. Wallace, meanwhile, felt the strain of becoming his entire universe. No crown. No palace. No formal role. Just the two of them against the world, forever tied to a decision that could never be undone. Here comes the mid-segment cliffhanger. And then came the political storm that would define the rest of their lives. Allegations that the former king maintained questionable associations during the rise of Nazi Germany. Whether these were exaggerated, misunderstood, or disturbingly accurate remains debated to this day. But once the rumors surfaced, the British government made its position unmistakably clear. Edward and Wallace could never be allowed to return to Britain, not even to live quietly. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor became, effectively, stateless symbols. Public enough to be watched. Irrelevant enough to be ignored. Important enough to be controlled. Their marriage endured, but it was built on isolation. When war erupted, they were moved to the Bahamas, where Edward was installed as governor, a posting many viewed as an intentional exile disguised as duty. The glamorous couple, once the center of a global scandal, now walked among palm trees and tropical winds, far from the monarchy that had defined and then rejected them. Even there, controversy followed. Even there, whispers carried across oceans. But in their private moments, behind closed doors, away from the newspapers, something quieter emerged. A strange kind of peace. Not happiness. Not triumph. But acceptance. Edward grew older. Softer. More reflective. He spoke often of Fort Belvedere, of the mornings he spent wandering the lawns, of the quiet evenings watching the sun disappear behind the trees. To him, that house had not just been a home. It had been the crossroads of his entire life. Wallace grew older too, her sharp wit mellowed by decades of public misunderstanding. She rarely spoke of the crown. She rarely spoke of the abdication. But in moments of candor, she admitted something almost no one expected. She wondered whether the world would have judged him less harshly if she had never stepped into his life. Their love endured, yes, but it carried the weight of an empire. When Edward died in 1972, Wallace stood alone. Her health declined, her memory faded, and the world that had once watched her with obsession slowly forgot her. Yet even then, visitors recalled something striking in her final years. She kept a photograph of Fort Belvedere beside her bed. Not of Buckingham Palace. Not of their wedding. Not of the life they built in exile. Fort Belvedere, the place where Edward had loved her most fiercely and lost the most. The monarchy survived. The nation moved on. But the echoes of that house still ring through modern history, A reminder that even the mightiest institutions can be reshaped by the quiet decisions made behind closed doors. And that sometimes, the greatest upheavals do not come from battles or revolutions, but from a single signature inside a forgotten fort.